When I served as associate rector at Church of the Nativity in Raleigh, North Carolina, I remember driving by a parking lot near a convenience store where day laborer migrant farm workers would gather hoping to find work, picking crops in the fields just outside of Raleigh. It always made me think of the parable from today's gospel lesson. It also gave me pause to question if those day laborers in North Carolina ever experienced the type of generosity and grace as the laborers Jesus speaks of in today's parable. Despite the fact that they pick much of the food we eat, migrant farm workers and other day laborers are not seen by most of us. We don't know them, and we know little, if anything, about their world. As I reflected on the sermon for this morning, I decided that it might be good for us to know at least a little bit more about their plight. What is it like to be a day laborer in our country today? According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, there are over 800,000 hired farm workers in the United States in any given year. They earn a median wage of $440 per week. That's $22,880 a year, assuming they can find work year-round and that they work every week. To put that in some perspective, for a family of three, that's just above the poverty line. For a family of four, it's living below the poverty line. Hired farm worker wages account for just under 1% of all farm earnings and about 3% of farm profits, and just another 1% of total farm production expenses. Now, this is not to overwhelm you with statistics, but it is to place in perspective for us those that do the hard labor of producing much of the food we eat share in only the smallest percentage of the revenue that is earned from a multi-billion-dollar-a-year farming industry. So it would seem that the situation of hired farm workers today, in fact, is not all that different from day laborers harvesting crops in Roman Palestine during Jesus' lifetime. So it makes today's parable particularly relevant. The day laborers in Roman Palestine were near the bottom of the economic ladder, usually landless peasants traveling from city to city, village to village, in hopes of finding work. So within this context, Jesus tells the parable as recorded in Matthew's gospel. It begins with Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard." Now, whenever Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like, he meant living with God is like the following scenario, or this is the way things should be. It is instruction as to how God views the world and the way in which followers of Jesus are called to respond. In our parable of the laborers in the vineyard, Jesus speaks of a landowner who pays all the hired workers according to the agreed upon daily wage. This proves him to be an honorable landowner who pays what he says he will pay, nothing more, nothing less. To pay above an agreed daily wage typically required a previous patron-client relationship between a landowner and a laborer. No such relationship exists between this landowner and the day laborers chosen to go work in his vineyard on this day. Each time the landowner goes out into the marketplace, he finds laborers still waiting to be asked to work. And each time he sends them into the vineyard to work, promising to pay what is right for the labor they will provide. Now, it's fair for us to assume that that meant they would be paid proportional to the time they worked. So this makes what the landowner did so extraordinary. When it comes time to pay the laborers at the end of the day, the landowner instructs his manager to pay all the workers the full day's wage, starting with those who were sent into the field last. Now, this didn't sit particularly well with those workers who toiled in the field all day. They felt it unfair. They say as much to the landowner. These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. What's interesting to note is that it's not that the last hired earned the full day's wage, which bothered those first hired. It's that they did not receive more than the already agreed upon full day's wage. Jesus includes this in his parable when they say, now when the first came, they thought they would receive more. They expected more than they had agreed to because the landowner chose to be generous to those hired last. It certainly was an act of generosity on the part of the landowner. He didn't need to pay more than the actual time worked. It was grace, because he recognized those hired last would have welcomed being asked to work at the beginning of the day, and after having labored all day would have thankfully and joyfully received the agreed upon daily wage. Jesus teaches of God having a different set of values than those of Roman Palestine. Values where God shows abundant generosity and grace equally to all. This is what living with God is like. It is what following Jesus means. The laborers in our parable are envious. Those picked first are envious. Had they been picked last and still paid the full day's wage, they would have readily accepted it for the generous and grace-filled offering that it was. Instead, they show envy and cry foul. What they failed to recognize is that equality for others did not mean less for them. It wasn't pie. As Jesus makes clear in the parable, generosity and grace are at the heart of God. Jesus challenges the notion that there are those less deserving of generosity, or that there are those undeserving of grace. God, through Christ, has made all deserving of God's generosity and equally receiving of God's grace. This should have a profound influence on how we, as disciples of Jesus, view the world. Do we choose to live into God's abundant generosity and grace for all, or flawed human constructs? St. Paul encourages Christians in Philippi to live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, standing firm in one spirit, striving side by side with one mind for the faith of the gospel. In other words, be generous as God is generous, and be grace-filled as God has shown us grace. 2 weeks ago, as some of you are aware, I attended the U2 concert when they were in Indianapolis for the Joshua Tree Tour 2017. I was tempted that week to slip some Gospel According to Bono into my sermon, but I typically have at least a general idea of what's coming up in the lectionary. And I, in fact, had looked ahead to the gospel lesson from Matthew for this week. And one of U2's songs immediately came to mind. It kept coming back to me as I reflected on Jesus' parable from today's gospel lesson. So I decided to do something that is a little uncharacteristic for me, something that's not always an easy thing for me to do, and that's to exercise patience. And so I waited until this week's homily to lay down some U2 lyrics on you. Now, even though U2 hasn't played this song as part of this year's Joshua Tree tour, it's perfect for today. The song's titled Grace. So I want to invite you to listen to some excerpts from the lyrics from this song. I will readily admit it is much better when it is sung, but I'm not going to sing it for you. But listen to the words that Bono writes. Grace, she takes the blame. She covers the shame, removes the stain. It could be her name. Grace is the name for a girl. It's also a thought that changed the world. And when she walks on the street, you can hear the strings. Grace finds goodness in everything. When she goes to work, you can hear her strings. Grace finds beauty in everything. What once was hurt, what once was friction, what left a mark no longer stings, because grace makes beauty out of ugly things. Grace makes beauty out of ugly things. My friends, we need more beauty, as there are ugly things in our world. We're reminded of them every time we turn on the news or they pop up in our Facebook or Twitter news feeds. But we know a deeper truth of God's abundant generosity. We recognize the gift of God's grace equally given for all. Countering the ugly things are generosity and grace offered in the name of Jesus. My heart delights each time I see those things in my social media feeds. Posts such as the youth group's Mission to the Mountains presentation from last week. Were you there for the presentation during the forum last Sunday? I can tell you it made me nearly cry tears of thankfulness and joy for their witness of God's generosity and grace. That's making beauty in the world. This morning, after the announcements, we will bless the outreach bags that are going to children in need here in Fishers. Toiletry items of shampoo and soaps and toothpaste and toothbrushes. That's making beauty in the world. So on this social media Sunday, while we are posting to Facebook, while we are tweeting out, let's fill the internet with what happens in this holy village. And every Sunday, every week, every day as we go about proclaiming the gospel, let's crowd out ugliness with beauty. Let's fill our community, the nation, and the world with examples of generosity and grace. I find myself, as I did in an earlier sermon this month, returning to the Holy Family mission statement, because it is a powerful witness in reflecting a call to proclaiming the gospel of Jesus. And it's a mission statement worth hearing now and again so that it may be on the lips and in the heart. To bear witness to the light of Christ by serving as the heart and hands of Jesus, nourishing people and transforming lives. Living that mission statement is Holy Family sharing God's generosity. Living that mission statement is Holy Family living God's grace. Remember, God's grace is not pie. No one receives less grace because we are generous in showing grace to others. And grace makes beauty out of ugly things. Amen.